The unexpected war. The skies burned red. Ships clashed in orbit, their weapons lighting up the darkness like dying stars. On the ground, explosions thundered across the battlefield, shaking the earth beneath the feet of warriors who had never known fear. The Drakari Empire, a race bred for war, marched forward with ruthless precision. At their head stood General Xelara, a legend among her kind. She was more than a leader, she was a force of nature. Her golden armor gleamed under the shattered sky, her silver eyes cold and calculating. To her, war was not just a necessity. It was an art. And humans? They were weak, soft, and undisciplined. They had no place in the universe. But today, they fought back. The battle was supposed to be easy. The Drakari had conquered a dozen worlds before, each one falling like dry leaves in the wind. But something was wrong. The humans weren't breaking. They weren't running. They were resisting. Xelara watched as her warriors clashed with human forces, expecting them to crumble. But the humans held the line. Their weapons were not as advanced, their bodies not as strong, but they fought with a ferocity she had never seen before. And then, she saw him. A lone human leading the charge, his movements fluid and precise. His name was Captain Daniel Rains, and unlike the others, he did not wear fear in his eyes. He moved like a shadow, weaving through the battlefield, his blade flashing through the air. Xelara narrowed her eyes. A human warrior? Laughable. No single human could stand against her. And yet, when their eyes met across the field, something inside her stirred. Then, he charged. Blaster fire screamed between them, but neither faltered. The battlefield faded away. There was only the hunt. Xelara unsheathed her energy blade, its edge humming with deadly power. She would end this human herself. But when steel met steel, she knew. This was no ordinary human. The clash of wills. The first strike was like thunder. Xelara's energy blade met Captain Rains's steel sword in a clash that sent a shockwave through the battlefield. Sparks exploded where their weapons met, the force of the impact sending both warriors skidding backward. For the first time in her life, Xelara felt the weight of an enemy's strength pushing against hers. She had fought countless battles, had crushed entire civilizations, but never had she faced a warrior who fought like this. His movements were flawless, his reflexes sharp. He should have been weaker, his species was inferior, fragile. And yet, he wasn't breaking. A slow, unfamiliar sensation crept into her mind. Excitement. Rains wasted no time. He lunged. Xelara twisted to the side, her golden armor gleaming as she dodged the slash by inches. She countered, her blade slicing through the air in a precise arc. But Rains was already moving, ducking beneath her strike, his blade coming up in a perfect counterattack. She barely deflected it. Their weapons clashed again, once, twice, 3 times, each blow faster, harder, more intense. The world around them faded. Explosions thundered in the distance, but neither warrior looked away. The battlefield was no longer a war between two armies. It was a war between them. Rains smirked. "You're fast." Xelara's silver eyes narrowed. "You're better than I expected, human." She pushed forward, her blade flashing as she aimed for his throat. But he was already gone, dodging with impossible speed. He twisted, kicking off a fallen Drakari soldier and launching himself toward her. He was adapting. Xelara blocked, but the impact sent a shudder through her body. His strength, his speed, they weren't natural. She felt it then. A strange, unsettling feeling growing inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she would win. Her grip tightened. Unacceptable. She lunged again, her blade moving like lightning. But Rains caught her wrist. Her breath hitched. No one had ever touched her in combat before. Her body reacted on instinct, twisting, breaking free, but the contact left something behind. A lingering heat. A sensation that felt like danger. Not from him. From herself. She stepped back, her mind racing. Her soldiers were still fighting, but she barely noticed them now. The human wasn't just her enemy. He was something else. Something she couldn't understand. Something she had to defeat. And yet, as she met his gaze, she felt something even more dangerous. A part of her didn't want to. The unbreakable human. Xelara had fought warriors who could crush boulders with their bare hands. She had battled creatures with claws that could tear through armor. She had stood against warlords who had conquered entire star systems. But this one human was more dangerous than all of them. Not because he was stronger. Not because he was faster. But because he wouldn't break. She struck again, her energy blade slicing through the air like a shooting star. Reigns dodged by a hair's width, his breath steady, his focus unshaken. His sword moved like it was part of him, a seamless extension of his will. He didn't fight like a man following orders. He fought like a man who refused to lose. Xelara's heart pounded against her ribs. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous. Fascination. She leaped back, her boots grinding against the dirt. The battlefield around them raged on, explosions, screams, the sound of metal clashing. But it all faded into nothing. All she saw was him. Reigns didn't attack right away. He studied her, like a predator trying to understand its prey. His dark eyes weren't filled with hatred. They were filled with something else. Something Xelara had never seen in an enemy before. Respect. She clenched her fists around her blade. No. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Humans were weak. They were undisciplined, reckless, emotional. So why was he still standing? She took a deep breath. She needed to end this. Now. Xelara lunged. Her speed was beyond anything human reflexes could follow. A perfect strike, elegant, precise, unstoppable. And he blocked it. Her eyes widened. Impossible. Not only had he blocked her, but he had countered. His sword grazed her shoulder, a shallow cut, but a cut nonetheless. No one had ever drawn her blood. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling, her silver eyes burning with something she couldn't name. Reigns tilted his head. You're holding back. Her breath caught in her throat. How? How could he see through her like that? She was holding back. She didn't know why. But she was. And that terrified her more than anything. For the first time in her life, Xelara wasn't just fighting an enemy. She was fighting herself. The breaking point. The moment her blood hit the ground, the battlefield seemed to freeze. Xelara stared at the thin red line across her shoulder, her blood. Not human. Not weak. Drakari blood. A warrior's blood. A leader's blood. And he had drawn it. A human. Her warriors saw it, too. Their eyes flickered with disbelief. Their general had been wounded. For the first time in her life, Xelara felt the weight of her own mortality. She was not invincible. She was not untouchable. And somehow, that thought did not bring her fear. It brought something far worse. Excitement. Reigns exhaled, shaking his wrist. His blade was steady, but she saw it now, the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. He had been fighting for hours, his strength slowly fading. And yet, he was still standing. Any other warrior would have faltered, knees buckling, arms trembling under the weight of so many battles. But not him. He refused to fall. Xelara tightened her grip on her blade. Why? Why did he keep going? Why didn't he surrender? Humans weren't supposed to fight like this. They weren't supposed to stand against her. The Drakari Empire had crushed entire civilizations, left worlds in ruins, reduced enemies to whispers in history. But this one human fought like he belonged in the stars. And for the first time, Xelara wanted to know why. She lunged, faster than before. Rains dodged, barely, but she saw it, the slight misstep, the heaviness in his breath. He was reaching his limit. She could end this now. One final strike. One final blow. But she hesitated. The hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Rains moved. Xelara saw his blade coming but did not stop it. The flat of his sword slammed against her armor, knocking the wind from her chest. She stumbled, she actually stumbled. Before she could recover, he grabbed her wrist. A mistake. No one touched Xelara. No one dared. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. It wasn't just his grip, it was the heat of his skin, the raw energy radiating from him. It was the fact that he was holding her not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as an equal. A silence stretched between them, thick with something neither of them understood. His dark eyes met hers, searching, questioning. And for the first time in her life, Xelara had no answer. The battlefield raged around them. Drakari warriors charged. Human soldiers fought. The war had not stopped. But for one fleeting moment, Xelara and Rains were the only two beings in the universe. And something had just changed. The shift in power. The moment stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Xelara had spent her entire life at the top. She had commanded armies, crushed rebellions, burned entire civilizations to the ground. No one had ever stood in her way. No one had ever dared to touch her. But now, this human held her wrist. And she did not pull away. A part of her mind screamed that this was wrong. A Drakari warlord, the Iron General, reduced to a moment of hesitation. But another part, a quieter, more dangerous part, wanted to know what he would do next. Rains didn't speak, didn't gloat, didn't try to humiliate her. He simply held her. Not with cruelty. Not with mockery. With understanding. It was infuriating. Xelara ripped her wrist free, stepping back, her breath sharp. "You fight well, human," she admitted, her voice tight. Rains smirked. "You're not so bad yourself." Her grip tightened around her blade. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Like she was just a warrior. Not a conqueror. Not a legend. Just a warrior. And for some reason, it unnerved her more than anything else. Behind them, the battle raged on. The Drakari forces were still stronger, faster, better armed. They should have been winning. But they weren't. The humans refused to fall. The Drakari were unstoppable, but the humans were unbreakable. Xelara looked around and saw something she had never seen before. Fear. Not in the humans. In her own soldiers. They saw the way she hesitated. They saw the blood on her shoulder. They saw the way this single human had held her and lived. Drakari did not fear death. They feared weakness. And now, for the first time, they were wondering. Is our leader weak? Xelara clenched her jaw. No. She was not weak. She could still end this. One order, and her forces would crush the humans. They would rain fire from the skies, tear through every last soldier, erase them from history. That was how war worked. That was how she had always won. But something stopped her. Rains had stepped back. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't pressing his advantage. He was just watching her. Like he was waiting. For what? For her to make a choice. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know what the right choice was. The humans could be wiped out. But at what cost? She had fought thousands of battles. But this was the first time she had ever felt like she might lose something more than a war. She didn't understand it. She hated it. But she couldn't ignore it. She had always thought humans were weak. But if that was true, why was it that she was the one hesitating? Why was it that, when she looked at Reigns, she felt like the one being tamed? The choice that changed everything. Xelara had never hesitated before. She had never second-guessed a command, never faltered in the heat of battle. She had crushed rebellions, burned cities, erased entire bloodlines from existence. But now, she stood frozen. Not because she was afraid. But because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted to win. Her silver eyes locked onto Reigns, who stood before her, not as a broken enemy, not as a man begging for mercy, but as an equal. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't retreating. He was waiting. For her. For her next move. Xelara's mind screamed at her to finish it. To end this human, to prove to her soldiers that she was still the warlord they feared. But then, she saw the battlefield behind him. She saw humans, battered and bloodied, still fighting. Still standing. The Drakari were stronger. They were faster. They had superior weapons. And yet, the humans would not surrender. Xelara clenched her fists. Why? Why wouldn't they break? Why wouldn't they kneel? She had spent her whole life believing that power was all that mattered. That the strong crushed the weak. That mercy was nothing more than a lie. But these humans. They weren't strong. Not like the Drakari. And yet, they were winning. Not with weapons. Not with force. But with something else. Xelara exhaled sharply, something inside her breaking. Her hand loosened around her blade. A flicker of uncertainty spread through her army. Her warriors saw it, the hesitation, the pause. And in that single moment, the battlefield changed. The Drakari soldiers, once relentless, began falling back. Not because they were outmatched, but because their leader was unsure. Xelara turned her gaze back to Reigns. The corner of his mouth lifted. Not in victory. Not in mockery. In understanding. He knew. He had never been trying to defeat her. He had been trying to make her see. Xelara inhaled deeply. She did. She had spent her whole life believing that strength came from dominance. But now, staring at the unbreakable humans, at this unbreakable human, she realized something terrifying. She had been wrong. A slow, heavy silence settled over the battlefield. The Drakari warriors looked at their general, waiting for the order. Xelara stepped forward. And for the first time in her life, she spoke not as a conqueror, but as a leader. Stand down. Gasps rippled through the Drakari ranks. Some of her warriors stiffened. Others looked at each other in disbelief. No one disobeyed General Xelara. And yet, she had just done the unthinkable. She had ended the war, not with blood, but with a choice. A choice she never thought she would make. She had been a warlord. A conqueror. A destroyer of civilizations. But today, a human had changed her. And for the first time. She didn't hate it. A future they never expected. For the first time in her life, General Xelara had surrendered. Not with words of defeat. Not with broken pride. But with a single command, stand down. Her warriors hesitated, their weapons still raised, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Drakari did not yield. They did not stop until the enemy was crushed beneath their feet. And yet, their leader, the Iron General, the unbreakable warlord, had stopped first. The battlefield, once filled with the roar of war, fell into a strange silence. Then, one by one, the Drakari soldiers lowered their weapons. The war was over. Reigns didn't move. He stood there, his breath still heavy, his body bruised and exhausted. He had prepared for everything, except for this. Except for her. Xelara turned to face him fully. The golden armor she wore was cracked, her silver eyes unreadable. She was no longer looking at him like an enemy. She was looking at him like a puzzle she had never been able to solve. "Why?" she asked, her voice softer than before. Reigns wiped blood from his brow and smirked. "Why what? Why didn't you break?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You think humans don't break?" His dark eyes flickered with something distant. "We do. We just get back up." Xelara studied him, the weight of his words settling deep inside her. She had spent her whole life conquering. Taking. Crushing anything that stood in her way. But this human had not fought to destroy her. He had fought to prove something. And now, standing before him, Xelara realized that he had. The Drakari were the strongest. But humans were something else entirely. They weren't the fastest. They weren't the most powerful. But they were relentless. They had no right to stand against an empire like hers. They should have lost this war before it even began. And yet, they hadn't. Because humans had something the Drakari didn't. Something even she, after all her victories, had never understood. Heart. Xelara exhaled slowly, something shifting inside her. The battlefield was still filled with smoke, with the scent of blood and war. But for the first time, she saw more than just destruction. She saw possibility. "What happens now?" she asked. Reigns met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, he smirked. "That depends. You still planning to conquer the galaxy?" Xelara didn't answer immediately. For the first time in her life, she didn't know the answer. The Drakari Empire had spent centuries spreading fear, forcing others into submission. It had been all she knew. But now, standing in front of this impossible human, she wondered. Was there another way? A long silence stretched between them before she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Not today." Reigns grinned. "That's a start." And for the first time in her life. Xelara smiled back. Epilogue, a different kind of war. The Drakari Empire did not collapse that day. But it changed. The humans did not destroy them. They did not seek revenge. Instead, they did something far stranger. They taught them. Taught them that strength wasn't just about power. That war wasn't the only way forward. That sometimes, the strongest thing you could do was to choose something else. And General Xelara, the Iron General, the unbreakable warlord, became something no Drakari had ever been before. A leader. Not through fear. But through understanding. And it all began with one unbreakable human.